If you're new here, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell, because what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. This is the kind of story that proves truth is darker than fiction. Let's dive in. August 14th, 2019. United States Penitentiary, Terre Haute, Indiana. The most secure federal death row facility in America. Inside cell number 7, a man named Eddie James sat on his steel bunk, hands trembling as he read a letter that had just been delivered. The paper was plain white, no return address, postmarked from Philadelphia. But it was the 3 words written inside that made Eddie's blood run cold. I know everything. Eddie's breathing became shallow. His eyes darted to the reinforced steel door, then to the small window covered with mesh wire. For 15 years, he had kept a secret buried so deep that not even the FBI, not the federal prosecutors, not the countless investigators who had dissected every moment of his life could find it. A secret so devastating that if it ever came to light, it would tear apart one of the most high-profile criminal cases in recent American history. But now someone knew. And in 48 hours, Eddie James was scheduled to die by lethal injection. The question wasn't whether he would die. That was certain. The appeals were exhausted, the Supreme Court had declined to hear his case, and the state of Indiana was ready to carry out his sentence. The question was whether his secret would die with him, or whether it would explode into the world in his final hours, destroying reputations, ending careers, and forcing people to confront a truth they had spent over a decade trying to bury. Eddie read the letter again, searching for clues about who sent it. The handwriting was neat, almost mechanical, giving nothing away about the writer's identity. No fingerprints would be found on the paper. Eddie was certain of that. Whoever sent this knew what they were doing. They wanted Eddie to know that his time was running out, that his secrets were no longer his own, that someone out there held his entire life in their hands. But before we understand why a man facing execution would be terrified of 3 words on a piece of paper, before we can comprehend what secret could be so powerful that it haunted him even in his final days, we need to go back. Back to where it all started. Back to a small coal mining town in West Virginia where Eddie James was just a kid trying to survive in a world that had already decided he didn't matter. Eddie James was born on March 7th, 1972, in Beckley, West Virginia. Beckley was the kind of town that time forgot, a place where cold dust settled on everything and opportunities were as scarce as clean air. The mines had been the lifeblood of the region for generations, but by the time Eddie came into the world, that lifeblood was poisoned. Black lung disease was killing miners faster than the mines could replace them, and families like the Jameses were left to pick up the pieces of broken dreams and broken bodies. Eddie's father, Robert James, had worked in the mines since he was 16 years old, dropped out of high school to help feed his family, spent 30 years breathing in coal dust and chemicals, and by the time he turned 45, his lungs were so damaged he couldn't walk up a flight of stairs without gasping for air. The mining company gave him a small disability check and a handshake, then forgot he existed. Robert spent his days sitting on the front porch of their rundown house, coughing up black phlegm and staring at nothing, a ghost of the man he used to be. Eddie's mother, Linda, worked 2 jobs just to keep the family afloat. During the day, she cleaned houses for wealthy families on the other side of town, scrubbing toilets and mopping floors for people who looked through her like she was invisible. At night, she waitressed at a 24-hour diner on Route 19, serving truckers and travelers who left small tips and smaller impressions. Linda rarely slept more than 4 hours a night, and it showed in the lines etched deep into her face, in the permanent exhaustion that dulled her eyes. Eddie was the middle child of 5 kids crammed into a 3-bedroom house that was falling apart. The roof leaked when it rained, the heating barely worked in winter, and there was never enough food to go around. Eddie learned early that if you wanted something, you had to fight for it, whether that meant fighting your siblings for the last piece of bread or fighting kids at school who thought poverty made you an easy target. But Eddie wasn't a fighter, not in the traditional sense. He was small for his age, skinny, with knobby knees and arms like twigs. He couldn't win fights with his fists, so he learned to win them with his brain. He watched people, studied them, figured out what they wanted and what they feared. He learned to manipulate situations to his advantage, to talk his way out of trouble, to become invisible when he needed to be and visible when it served him. Teachers at Beckley Elementary School remembered Eddie as a quiet kid who sat in the back of the classroom and rarely spoke unless called on. He wasn't a troublemaker, didn't act out or cause disruptions. He just existed in the background, easily overlooked, easily forgotten. But his fourth-grade teacher, Mrs. Patricia Henderson, noticed something that others missed. Eddie was always watching. While other kids fidgeted and daydreamed, Eddie observed. He studied the teacher's patterns, memorized when she would call on students, figured out how to avoid being put on the spot. He watched the other kids too, learning their weaknesses, their secrets, the things that made them vulnerable. Years later, when federal investigators interviewed Mrs. Henderson about Eddie James, she would tell them something that sent chills down their spines. Eddie was different from other children, she said, her voice quiet and troubled. Most kids that age are open books. You can see what they're thinking, what they're feeling. But Eddie, it was like he had a wall up. He was always calculating, always thinking 3 steps ahead. It wasn't normal for a 9-year-old. I remember thinking that this child was either going to do something great or something terrible. There was no in-between with Eddie James. By the time Eddie reached middle school, the wall Mrs. Henderson had noticed had become impenetrable. Eddie had learned that emotions were a liability, that caring about people made you weak, that the only person you could truly rely on was yourself. His father's illness had worsened, the medical bills were piling up, and his mother was working herself into an early grave trying to keep the family together. Eddie watched it all happen with a detached sense of inevitability, like he was observing someone else's tragedy rather than living his own. At 13, Eddie got his first taste of easy money. A kid at school, a 16-year-old dropout named Marcus Williams, needed someone to deliver packages around town. Small packages, wrapped in brown paper, handed off to customers who paid in cash and didn't ask questions. Marcus offered Eddie $50 for a few hours of work. $50 was more than Eddie's mother made in 2 days of scrubbing floors and serving coffee. Eddie took the job without hesitation. He didn't ask what was in the packages. He didn't need to. He already knew. Beckley, like most struggling towns in Appalachia, had been flooded with drugs for years. First it was pills, prescription painkillers that doctors handed out like candy to injured minors. Then when the prescriptions ran out and the addiction remained, people turned to heroin. It was cheaper, easier to get, and just as effective at numbing the pain of lives that had gone off the rails. Eddie was smart enough to know he was delivering poison, but he was also practical enough to know that someone was going to deliver it regardless. Might as well be him getting paid. Marcus Williams, who everyone called Trigger for reasons Eddie never asked about, was impressed with the skinny 13-year-old who never asked questions and never made mistakes. Eddie was punctual, discreet, and smart. He memorized addresses after seeing them once, never wrote anything down, and had an instinct for avoiding trouble. Within 6 months, Eddie was making more money than his mother, and he started slipping cash into her purse when she wasn't looking, anonymous contributions that helped pay the electricity bill or buy groceries. Linda James never asked where the money came from. Maybe she knew and chose to ignore it. Maybe she was too exhausted to care. Or maybe she was just grateful that for the first time in years, she didn't have to choose between paying rent and feeding her children. Whatever the reason, she took the money and said nothing, and Eddie continued working for Trigger. By the time Eddie turned 16, he wasn't just making deliveries anymore. He was managing territory, coordinating drops, recruiting younger kids to do the grunt work he used to do. Trigger had recognized something in Eddie that others had missed, a cold, calculating intelligence that made him perfect for the drug trade. Eddie didn't use the product he sold, didn't party or show off his money. He saved everything, stashed cash in places only he knew about, and planned for a future that didn't involve dying young in Beckley, West Virginia. High school was a formality for Eddie, something he attended because not attending would draw unwanted attention. He maintained a solid B average without really trying, showed up to enough classes to avoid truancy charges, and blended into the background like he always had. Teachers barely remembered him. Classmates couldn't have picked him out of a lineup. Eddie James was a ghost, moving through the world without leaving fingerprints. But while Eddie was invisible to most people, he was becoming very visible to Trigger. By Eddie's senior year, Trigger had promoted him to lieutenant, second in command of an operation that moved hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of heroin and cocaine through the region every month. Eddie was 18 years old, had never been arrested, and was making more money than most adults in Beckley would see in a lifetime. He bought his mother a new car, paid off the mortgage on the family house, and set up a college fund for his younger siblings. He did all of this anonymously, through carefully structured cash transactions that left no paper trail. The only person who knew the source of the family's sudden good fortune was Eddie's father. Robert James might have been dying, his lungs destroyed and his body failing, but his mind was still sharp. He watched his son come and go at odd hours, noticed the expensive clothes Eddie tried to hide, saw the way certain people in town looked at Eddie with fear and respect. One night, sitting on that same front porch where he'd spent years coughing up his life, Robert called Eddie over. "I know what you're doing," Robert said, his voice raspy and weak. "I know who you're working for." Eddie stood silent, waiting for the lecture, the disappointment, the demand that he stop. But it never came. Instead, Robert looked at his son with something that might have been pride, might have been resignation, might have been both. "You're smarter than I ever was. You found a way out. Just promise me one thing. Don't end up like the people you're selling to. Don't let this world eat you alive." Eddie promised, though he wasn't sure he could keep it. 3 months later, Robert James died in his sleep, his damaged lungs finally giving out. Eddie paid for the funeral in cash, a modest service that the family could never have afforded otherwise. He stood by his father's grave and felt nothing, no grief, no sadness, just a cold emptiness that had been growing inside him for years. He was 19 years old and already dead inside, a walking corpse dressed in expensive clothes and carrying a pocket full of blood money. After his father's death, Eddie threw himself deeper into the work. Trigger was expanding operations, moving into new territory, making connections with suppliers in Columbus and Pittsburgh. He needed someone he could trust to handle the logistics, someone smart enough to avoid law enforcement and ruthless enough to handle problems when they arose. Eddie was that person. By the time he turned 20, Eddie was running the entire West Virginia operation while Trigger focused on building relationships with major suppliers up the East Coast. The money was incredible, more than Eddie had ever imagined. He was pulling in $10,000, sometimes $15,000 a week. He bought a condo in Charleston under a fake name, drove a modest car to avoid attention, and lived like a king in private while maintaining the appearance of a regular working-class kid in public. He was careful, always careful, never taking unnecessary risks, never leaving evidence that could connect him to the operation. But in the summer of 1993, Eddie made his first real mistake. It wasn't a mistake born of carelessness or greed. It was something worse, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life and ultimately contribute to his presence on death row 26 years later. That mistake involved a deal gone wrong, a desperate decision made in a moment of panic, and the death of a 14-year-old boy named Daniel Pritchard. But we're not there yet. Because before we get to June 4th, 1993, before we understand the secret that would eventually lead to that letter in Eddie's cell, we need to talk about what happened 1 year later. We need to talk about a woman named Sarah Mitchell, a DEA informant with green eyes and a smile that could make Eddie forget who he was. We need to talk about love and betrayal, about trust and deception, about the moment when Eddie James, the ghost who never made mistakes, fell in love with someone who was paid to destroy him. Summer, 1994. Charleston, West Virginia. Eddie James was 22 years old, running one of the most successful drug operations in the Appalachian region, and he had never felt more alone. The money was good, better than good, but it came with a price. Eddie had no real friends, only associates and employees. He had no family he could talk to honestly. His mother still believed he worked construction. He had no one he could trust with the truth of who he really was. That isolation was eating away at him, creating a hollowness that no amount of cash could fill. On a Thursday night in late June, Eddie walked into a bar called the River's Edge, a dive establishment on the east side of Charleston that catered to blue-collar workers and people who didn't ask too many questions. Eddie came here occasionally when the walls of his condo started closing in, when he needed to be around people even if he couldn't truly connect with them. He ordered a whiskey, neat, and sat at the far end of the bar where he could watch the door and everyone who came through it. That's when he saw her. Sarah Mitchell walked in around 9 p.m., blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a simple white t-shirt. She wasn't dressed to impress, wasn't trying to be noticed, but Eddie noticed her anyway. There was something about the way she moved, confident but not arrogant, aware of her surroundings without being obvious about it. She ordered a beer and took a seat 3 stools down from Eddie, close enough to be in his peripheral vision, but not so close as to seem intentional. For 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. Eddie nursed his whiskey and watched the baseball game playing on the TV above the bar. Sarah did the same, occasionally checking her phone, seemingly waiting for someone who wasn't coming. Then, during a commercial break, she turned to Eddie and asked him a simple question. "You follow baseball?" Her voice was casual, friendly, the kind of voice that invited conversation without demanding it. Eddie should have said no. He should have finished his drink and left. Every instinct he had developed over the years told him that strangers who initiated conversation were dangerous, that people who seemed too friendly usually had ulterior motives. But there was something about Sarah's green eyes, something genuine that Eddie hadn't seen in a long time, that made him ignore those instincts. "Not really," he replied. "Just watching because it's on." Sarah smiled, and it was a real smile, not the fake ones Eddie was used to seeing from people who wanted something from him. "Same here," she said. "I'm supposed to be meeting a friend, but she just texted that she can't make it. Now I'm sitting in a bar by myself on a Thursday night, which is pretty pathetic." She laughed at herself, and Eddie found himself smiling back. They started talking. Small talk at first, safe topics like the weather and how overpriced the drinks were. But gradually, the conversation deepened. Sarah told Eddie she had moved to Charleston 6 months ago for work, that she was still getting to know the city, that she didn't have many friends yet. She said she worked in insurance, claims processing, boring desk work that paid the bills but didn't exactly inspire passion. Eddie told her he worked in construction, flipping houses, and doing renovations. The lie came easily, polished from years of practice. What Eddie didn't know was that every word Sarah said was carefully calculated. Her name wasn't really Sarah Mitchell, though that was the identity she had been using for the past 8 months. She was a confidential informant for the Drug Enforcement Administration, recruited after being arrested with a small amount of cocaine at a traffic stop. The DEA had given her a choice: face prosecution and possible jail time, or work as an informant and help them infiltrate the drug networks operating in West Virginia. Sarah, who had a young daughter to think about, had chosen cooperation. Her assignment was to get close to mid-level dealers and distributors, gain their trust, and feed information back to her handler, Special Agent David Torres. The DEA knew that someone was running a major operation in the region, moving serious weight, and staying completely off their radar. They had arrested dozens of street-level dealers, but none of them knew who was at the top. The operation was compartmentalized, carefully structured so that if one piece fell, it wouldn't bring down the whole organization. Sarah's job was to work her way up the chain until she found the person running everything. Meeting Eddie that night at the river's edge wasn't an accident. The DEA had been watching Eddie for 3 weeks. Ever since a dealer they arrested mentioned a guy named Eddie who sometimes handled higher-level transactions. They didn't have enough for a warrant, didn't even have a last name, but they had a description and a few locations where Eddie had been spotted. Agent Torres had instructed Sarah to frequent those locations, to put herself in position to make contact, and to let Eddie come to her. The plan worked better than anyone expected. After that first night at the bar, Eddie asked for Sarah's number. She gave it to him, along with a smile that made his carefully constructed walls crack just a little. They started texting, casual messages at first, then longer conversations. A week later, Eddie asked her to dinner. Sarah said yes, knowing that every moment they spent together was bringing her closer to completing her mission. Their first real date was at a small Italian restaurant in downtown Charleston. Eddie arrived early, dressed in clothes that looked casual but cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was nervous, though he tried not to show it. Eddie James, who could stare down armed dealers without flinching, who had orchestrated drug deals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, was nervous about a dinner date. When Sarah arrived, wearing a simple black dress and that genuine smile, Eddie's nervousness melted into something else, something dangerous. He was falling for her, and he knew it. Over dinner, they talked for hours. Sarah was easy to talk to, asked the right questions without being nosy, shared enough about herself to seem open without revealing anything real. Eddie found himself wanting to tell her everything, to unburden himself of secrets he had carried alone for years. But he held back, years of discipline and paranoia, keeping his mouth shut even as his heart opened up. What Eddie didn't know was that Sarah was wearing a wire. Hidden in her purse was a small recording device that captured every word of their conversation. Back at DEA headquarters, Agent Torres listened in real time, taking notes, analyzing Eddie's words for clues about his operation. But that first date yielded nothing useful. Eddie was too careful, too practiced at maintaining his cover story. Torres told Sarah to keep going, to get closer, to make Eddie trust her enough to let his guard down. Over the next 2 months, Eddie and Sarah became inseparable. They spent almost every evening together, going to movies, taking drives through the West Virginia mountains, cooking dinner at Eddie's condo. Eddie had never let anyone into his space before, but he let Sarah in. She saw the expensive furniture, the high-end electronics, the closet full of designer clothes. She asked how a construction worker could afford all this, and Eddie explained it away with stories about smart investments and a dead relative who had left him money. Sarah pretended to believe him, all while photographing his apartment when he wasn't looking and reporting every detail back to Agent Torres. The DEA was building a profile, piecing together evidence, but they still didn't have enough for an arrest. They needed Sarah to get Eddie to talk about his actual work, to admit on tape what he really did for a living. Torres was getting impatient. He pushed Sarah harder, demanded she take more risks, get Eddie to introduce her to his associates. But Sarah was starting to have doubts. The problem was, Eddie wasn't what Sarah expected. The DEA had painted him as a typical drug dealer, someone motivated by greed and power, someone who didn't care about the damage he caused. But the Eddie that Sarah got to know was different. He was quiet, thoughtful, surprisingly kind. He asked about her day, remembered small details she mentioned in passing, treated her with a respect she hadn't experienced in a long time. He never pressured her for anything, never made her feel unsafe, never showed the violent tendencies she associated with drug dealers. Sarah found herself in a moral gray area she hadn't anticipated. Yes, Eddie was a criminal. Yes, he sold drugs that destroyed lives and communities. But he was also a human being, someone shaped by poverty and limited options, someone trying to survive in a world that had never given him a fair chance. Sarah started to wonder if turning him in was justice or just another form of systemic failure, the system punishing people it had already abandoned. 3 months into their relationship, Eddie did something that changed everything. Sarah had mentioned her daughter, Emma, a 7-year-old girl living with Sarah's mother while Sarah worked in Charleston. Sarah said she was struggling to pay for Emma's asthma medication, that insurance didn't cover everything, and the costs were adding up. 2 days later, Eddie handed Sarah an envelope containing $5,000 in cash. "For Emma," he said simply. "Kids shouldn't suffer because of money." Sarah was stunned. She tried to refuse, said it was too much, but Eddie insisted. "I have it. You need it. End of discussion." Sarah took the money with tears in her eyes, and that night, she sat in her apartment staring at the envelope and hating herself. This man, this criminal she was supposed to betray, had just given her $5,000 to help a child he'd never met. Meanwhile, she was recording his conversations and preparing to send him to prison for the rest of his life. Agent Torres saw the money as evidence of Eddie's drug proceeds and demanded Sarah keep it as proof. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was the villain in this story, not Eddie. She started feeding Torres less information, holding back details, subtly sabotaging the investigation without being obvious about it. Torres noticed. During a meeting in September, he confronted her. "You're compromised," Torres said, his voice cold and accusatory. "You're protecting him." Sarah denied it, insisted she was just being careful, building trust before pushing for more substantial evidence. But Torres wasn't buying it. He had seen this pattern before with other informants, people who got too close to their targets and lost sight of the mission. He gave Sarah an ultimatum. "You have until the end of October to get us Eddie James. Real evidence, recorded confessions, introduction to his suppliers. If you don't deliver, I'm pulling you out and charging you as an accomplice. You'll lose your daughter, you'll lose everything. Choose wisely." Sarah left that meeting feeling sick to her stomach. She had 6 weeks to decide between the man she was falling in love with and the daughter she would die for. There was no good choice, no path that didn't end in someone getting destroyed. She thought about running, taking Emma and disappearing, but the DEA would find her. She thought about warning Eddie, telling him to run, but that would make her a criminal too. She was trapped, caught between 2 impossible options, and time was running out. In early October, Eddie noticed that something was wrong. Sarah seemed distant, distracted, like her mind was somewhere else even when they were together. He asked if everything was okay, if he had done something wrong. Sarah assured him everything was fine, blamed it on work stress and problems with her ex-husband. Eddie wanted to believe her, but his instincts, Those same instincts that had kept him alive and out of prison for years were screaming that something wasn't right. Eddie started doing his own investigation. He had people follow Sarah, watch where she went when she wasn't with him, see who she talked to. What they discovered confirmed his worst fears. Sarah had been seen meeting with a man in a parking garage, someone who looked like law enforcement. She had been photographed entering the federal building in Charleston. Phone records showed calls to a number registered to the DEA. Eddie's heart sank as the pieces fell into place. The woman he loved, the first person he had trusted in years, was working for the people trying to destroy him. Eddie had a choice to make. He could kill Sarah, make her disappear like he had made others disappear when they became problems. He could run, abandon everything he had built, and start over somewhere else. Or he could confront her, hear the truth from her own mouth, and decide from there. Eddie chose confrontation. On November 3rd, 1994, Eddie invited Sarah to his condo for dinner. She arrived with wine and a smile, completely unaware of what was coming. They ate, made small talk, pretended everything was normal. Then, after dinner, as they sat on his couch, Eddie turned to her with an expression she had never seen before. Cold, hard, dangerous. I know who you are, Eddie said quietly. I know what you are. Sarah's blood froze. Her mind raced through options, escape routes, excuses. But Eddie was faster. DEA informant. Confidential source. Working with Agent David Torres. You've been wearing a wire, taking pictures, reporting back everything I say and do. Did I miss anything? Sarah couldn't speak. Terror gripped her throat. She had seen what happened to people who crossed drug dealers. Bodies found in ditches, families who never got closure. She was about to become another statistic, another cautionary tale about the price of betrayal. But instead of violence, Eddie just looked sad, tired, disappointed. How long have you known? Sarah finally managed to whisper. About 3 weeks, Eddie replied. I had you followed. Confirmed my suspicions. Been waiting to see if you'd come clean, give me a chance to explain my side. But you didn't. You just kept lying. Sarah started crying, apologies tumbling out between sobs, explanations about her daughter and having no choice and never meaning to hurt him. Eddie listened in silence. When she finally stopped talking, Eddie made her an offer that shocked her. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to hurt your daughter. But you're going to help me. You're going to feed your handler exactly what I tell you to feed him. False information, fake leads, anything I need to buy time and protect my operation. And in return, I'll make sure you and Emma are taken care of. Financially set for life. Deal. Sarah should have said no. She should have recorded this conversation, used it as evidence to finally bring Eddie down. But she was terrified, desperate, and swimming in guilt over having betrayed someone who had shown her nothing but kindness. So she nodded. She agreed. And for the next 2 weeks, Sarah Mitchell became a double agent, working for Eddie James while pretending to work for the DEA. Eddie fed Sarah false information about shipment routes that didn't exist, meetings that would never happen, suppliers who were actually just random civilians. Sarah dutifully passed it all to Agent Torres, who assembled task forces and raided empty warehouses while Eddie cleaned house and prepared to disappear. It was a brilliant plan, buying Eddie time to liquidate assets and create an exit strategy. But Eddie had made one critical miscalculation. He underestimated how much the DEA already knew, and he underestimated Sarah's conscience. Because despite her fear, despite her agreement to help Eddie, Sarah couldn't live with herself knowing that her lies were allowing poison to keep flowing into communities, destroying families, ending lives. So on November 16th, Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She went to Agent Torres and told him everything. Every detail of Eddie's operation, his real name, his addresses, his suppliers, his distribution network. She told Torres about Eddie's plan to use her as a disinformation source. And she agreed to wear a wire one final time, to meet with Eddie and get him to confess everything on tape. It was the ultimate betrayal, and Sarah knew it would probably get her killed. But she also knew it was the right thing to do. Agent Torres promised Sarah protection. He promised that once Eddie was arrested, she and her daughter would be placed in witness protection, given new identities, relocated somewhere Eddie's organization could never find them. Sarah wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. Because if she didn't, then what she was about to do was suicide. On November 17th, Sarah called Eddie and asked to meet. She said she had important information about the DEA's next moves, that Torres was suspicious and they needed to talk. Eddie agreed to meet at a safe house he owned on the outskirts of Charleston. What Eddie didn't know was that Sarah would be wearing a wire and that dozens of federal agents would be waiting nearby, ready to move in the moment they had enough evidence to make the arrest stick. November 20th, 1994. 5 a.m. Dozens of DEA agents prepared for the largest coordinated strike West Virginia had seen in years. Agent David Torres sat in an unmarked van, listening through headphones as tactical teams received final orders. After 8 months of investigation, they finally had Eddie James. The wire Sarah wore had captured everything: admissions, supplier names, the entire distribution network. Torres smiled. This ghost was finally caught. At 5:30, Torres gave the command. All units, execute. 12 teams hit 12 locations simultaneously. Battering rams crashed through doors, flashbangs exploded, agents in tactical gear flooded buildings. Within 20 minutes, 32 people were in custody. For $1 million in cash, 70 kilograms of heroin, 30 kilograms of cocaine, and enough weapons to arm a militia. It was a massive bust. But when the tactical team breached Eddie's safe house, they found it empty. No Eddie, no evidence, just bare walls. Torres's triumph curdled into frustration. They had arrested Eddie's entire network, but the man himself was gone. For 3 weeks, Eddie was a ghost. No credit cards, no calls, no sightings. The DEA plastered his face across every news channel, offered $50,000 for information. They interviewed everyone who knew him, including his mother, but no one knew where he'd gone. Eddie had been planning his escape for weeks. The moment Sarah showed up to their final meeting, he knew she was wearing a wire. He'd been in the game too long not to recognize the signs. He played along, gave her a full confession, knowing the DEA would coordinate a large operation before moving. That window was all he needed. He spent the first week in a Pennsylvania cabin, watching news coverage of the raids. He saw his face on TV, heard reporters call him a major drug trafficker. Eddie felt nothing, just cold calculation about his next move. The second week, he moved to a Pittsburgh motel, paying cash. He spent days planning and nights thinking about Sarah. Despite everything, he couldn't hate her. She was protecting her daughter, making an impossible choice. Eddie understood impossible choices. On December 9th, Eddie sat in a stolen pickup at a Tennessee rest stop. He had enough money to disappear permanently, enough fake IDs to become someone else. He could run, and they'd probably never find him. But running meant spending life looking over his shoulder. Eddie was exhausted. What if instead of running, he made them an offer they couldn't refuse? Eddie had information that could bring down people far more important than himself. Suppliers with connections to organized crime and corrupt officials. The DEA had arrested his street-level network, but hadn't touched the real power players. Eddie could give them those names, testify, help dismantle major organizations. In exchange, maybe he could negotiate a deal that didn't involve life in prison. Eddie called the FBI tip line. Within an hour, police surrounded the rest stop. Eddie sat with hands visible on the steering wheel as officers approached with weapons drawn. They dragged him out, cuffed him roughly. Eddie didn't resist. "I want to make a deal. I have information." Agent Torres flew in the next morning. Eddie was calm and businesslike. "I'll give you everyone. My suppliers, their suppliers, the whole chain. I'll testify in court, give you recordings, documents, everything. But I want a deal. Reduced sentence, minimum security, and Sarah Mitchell gets witness protection with her daughter. Non-negotiable." As Eddie began naming names and providing details only an insider would know, Torres realized this was legitimate. Over the next week, prosecutors negotiated. Eddie would plead guilty to conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. For his cooperation, he'd receive 15 years in minimum security instead of life. And Sarah would be placed in witness protection. Sarah hadn't asked for protection. When Torres told her about Eddie's condition, she broke down crying. Even after betraying him, Eddie was still protecting her. The paperwork was finalized in January 1995. Eddie spent months being debriefed, providing detailed information about his operation and the network that supplied it. The crown jewel was Vincent Russo, a Philadelphia supplier with mob connections. For 20 years, Russo had moved massive quantities of drugs, always staying ahead of law enforcement. Eddie had dealt directly with Russo 3 times and had recordings, receipts, and photographs. Prosecutors were ecstatic. Taking down Russo would be the case of their careers. The trial began in August 1995. Eddie took the stand on day 3. For 3 days, he methodically dismantled Russo's empire, describing deals in precise detail. Russo's attorneys attacked his character, suggested he was lying for a reduced sentence. But the evidence backed up everything Eddie said. On September 22nd, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Vincent Russo was sentenced to life without parole. Russo's eyes found Eddie in the courtroom, and the look he gave him was pure murder. Eddie stared back, unflinching. He'd just signed his own death warrant. Eddie was transferred to Federal Correctional Institution Allenwood in Pennsylvania to begin his 15-year sentence. But within months, new inmates with Philadelphia ties arrived, looking at Eddie with hatred. Guards became cold and distant. The contract on his life was active. On March 7, 1999, 3 men attacked Eddie in the prison laundry room. Eddie grabbed a metal cart and shoved it into his attacker, screaming for help. Guards arrived just in time. As Tony DeLuca was dragged away, he mouthed 2 words, "You're dead." Eddie was placed in protective custody, a 6 by 8 foot cell with 23-hour lockdown. For years of isolation. No programs, no work, no human contact. Just endless solitude. In 2003, Vincent Russo died in prison. Heart attack. With Russo gone, the contract should have ended. But the attempts continued. Eddie's testimony had destroyed an entire network. The target on his back was about revenge now. Eddie was transferred multiple times over the next years. Pennsylvania to Ohio to Kentucky to Indiana, never staying long enough to establish exploitable routines. Always looking over his shoulder. It was exhausting, but it kept him alive. By 2007, Eddie had served 12 years. He was eligible for parole. But 3 months before his hearing, a body was discovered in a shallow grave outside Beckley. Dental records identified the victim as Sarah Mitchell. She'd been dead for approximately 8 years, killed shortly after Eddie's trial ended. The autopsy revealed 2 bullets to the back of the head, execution style. The investigation went cold immediately. No witnesses, no suspects, no leads. But Eddie knew it was connected to Russo, to the mob, to the empire he'd helped destroy. Eddie refused parole. He told the board he wasn't ready, needed more time. Behind the scenes, he was buying time to plan, to figure out how to survive in a world that wanted him dead. His attorney thought he was insane. For 2 years, Eddie investigated Sarah's murder from behind bars, reaching out to old contacts, people who owed him favors. Slowly, pieces fell into place. Sarah hadn't been killed by Russo's people. She'd been killed by someone inside law enforcement, someone with access to witness protection details. Eddie's investigation led to Detective Raymond Clark, a corrupt Charleston cop on Russo's payroll. Clark had accessed Sarah's file and sold her location for $50,000. But Clark wasn't working alone. There was someone higher up who orchestrated everything. In 2009, Eddie accepted parole. He moved into a Pittsburgh halfway house, got a job washing dishes, lived like a ghost. But at night, he continued investigating. 6 months later, Eddie found the answer. The person who ordered Sarah's death wasn't connected to Russo at all. It was Special Agent David Torres, Sarah's DA handler. Torres had been dirty for years, skimming money, protecting suppliers. When Sarah started having doubts about continuing as an informant, Torres saw her as a liability. Eddie had a choice: go to authorities and risk being dismissed or killed, or take justice into his own hands. On a February night in 2010, Eddie tracked Torres to a bar outside Pittsburgh, followed him to the parking lot, and confronted him. Torres laughed, called him a washed-up criminal with delusions. Eddie had recordings, documents, everything to destroy Torres. He gave Torres the same choice Sarah had given him years ago: confess and cooperate, or face consequences. Torres pulled a gun. Eddie was faster. The shot echoed through the parking lot. Eddie didn't run. He waited for police, hands raised. When officers arrived, Eddie told them everything about Sarah, about Torres, about the corruption. But without physical evidence beyond Eddie's word, the case fell apart. Eddie was charged with first-degree murder. No deals this time. After a 3-week trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Eddie James arrived on death row at United States Penitentiary Terre Haute in June 2010. Cell number 7, 8 by 10 feet of concrete, became his final address. A steel bunk, a stainless steel toilet, a small desk bolted to the wall. 23 hours a day in that box, 1 hour in a cage they called the recreation yard. This was where Eddie would wait to die. Most men on death row clung to hope, filing appeals, believing some technicality would save them. Eddie filed the mandatory appeals because his attorney insisted, but his heart wasn't in it. He had killed a federal agent in cold blood. The evidence was overwhelming. There would be no miracle. Eddie had accepted his fate the moment he pulled the trigger. But accepting death and waiting for it were different things. The appeals process dragged on for years. Courts reviewed, judges deliberated, motions were filed and denied. Eddie watched other inmates come and go, some executed, some granted stays, some dying naturally before the state could kill them. Time moved differently on death row, stretching and compressing until days felt like weeks and years felt like moments. Eddie used the time to write, not appeals or legal documents, but a memoir. He chronicled everything: his childhood in Beckley, his rise in the drug trade, his relationship with Sarah, the betrayal, the testimony, the corruption, the murder. He filled notebook after notebook with cramped handwriting, documenting every detail. His attorney warned him anything he wrote could be subpoenaed, used against him. Eddie didn't care. He wasn't writing for the courts. He was writing for the truth. In 2014, Eddie received an unexpected visitor. Rebecca Stone, a journalist from the Washington Post, wanted to interview him for a series on wrongful convictions and corruption in law enforcement. Eddie wasn't wrongfully convicted. He had killed Torres, but the circumstances interested her. The corruption, the murdered informant, the DEA agent who orchestrated it all. Over 6 months, Rebecca visited Eddie a dozen times. She reviewed his notebooks, investigated his claims, tracked down witnesses. What she uncovered shocked her. Torres had indeed been dirty, involved in at least 7 cases where evidence was manipulated or witnesses disappeared. Rebecca's investigation corroborated much of Eddie's story, though it couldn't change his conviction. Her article was published in March 2015, causing a scandal within the DEA and leading to an internal investigation that quietly buried the findings. Eddie gained a small following after the article. True crime enthusiasts, anti-corruption activists, people who saw him as more complicated than just a murderer. He received letters, mostly supportive, some condemning, others asking questions. Eddie answered some, ignored most. He wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. He just wanted to tell his story before the state silenced him forever. By 2017, Eddie's appeals were exhausted. The Supreme Court declined to hear his case. His execution date was set for August 16, 2019. Eddie had 2 years to prepare for death. He spent those years watching the world change through his small television, reading books, and writing final letters to the few people who still cared. One person he couldn't write to was Sarah. Her grave was in a private cemetery, unmarked to protect her identity even in death. Eddie requested permission to visit before his execution. Denied. Security risk, they said. So he wrote letters to her in his notebook, letters that would never be sent, apologies that would never be heard. In July 2019, 1 month before his scheduled execution, Eddie received a letter that made his hands shake. Postmarked from Philadelphia, no return address. 3 handwritten words on a single sheet. I know everything. Eddie read it repeatedly, trying to understand what it meant, who sent it, what they knew. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The paper generic, untraceable. But the timing was deliberate. Someone wanted Eddie to know they possessed information important enough to send to a man with 30 days left to live. Eddie's mind raced through possibilities. About Torres? About Sarah? About something else entirely, something forgotten or never known. Eddie tried to trace the letter through his attorney. It led nowhere. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. Whoever sent it knew how to stay hidden. Eddie reviewed his notebooks, searching for anything he might have missed, any detail explaining the message. Days turned into weeks. The execution date loomed closer. On August 10th, 6 days before his scheduled death, Eddie received a second letter. Same handwriting, same anonymous postmark. This one contained a photograph. Eddie's breath caught when he saw it. The photo showed Sarah, alive, sitting in a cafe, dated 3 months after she was supposedly murdered. Eddie's world tilted sideways. The body identified as Sarah Mitchell wasn't Sarah at all. Someone had planted false dental records, staged the entire thing. Sarah was alive, or had been alive years after Eddie was told she was dead. But if Sarah was alive, who was buried in that grave? And why had someone gone to such elaborate lengths to fake her death? Eddie demanded to see his attorney immediately. When the lawyer arrived, Eddie showed him the photograph and explained what it meant. The attorney was skeptical, suggested it could be doctored, a cruel prank to torture Eddie in his final days. But Eddie knew better. The photo was real. He could see it in Sarah's eyes, in details only someone who truly knew her would capture. The attorney agreed to investigate, but with only 6 days until execution, time was impossibly short. Eddie spent those days in a fog of confusion, hope, and rage. If Sarah was alive, everything he believed about her death was wrong. Torres might have been dirty, but maybe he wasn't Sarah's killer. Maybe Eddie had murdered an innocent man, or at least a man innocent of that particular crime. On August 14th, 48 hours before his execution, Eddie received the third and final letter. This one was longer, a full page. It began simply, "Sarah Mitchell is alive, and I can prove it." The letter explained that Sarah had faked her death with help from someone inside witness protection, someone who believed Eddie would eventually be released and come looking for her. The body in the grave was a Jane Doe from a different case, someone whose death could be exploited for the deception. The letter claimed Sarah had been living under a new identity in Vancouver, Canada, working as a librarian, completely removed from her past life. She wanted Eddie to believe she was dead, so he would stop looking for her, stop putting himself in danger for her sake. The murder Torres orchestrated wasn't Sarah's. It was someone else's, a loose end from another operation. Eddie had killed Torres for the wrong reason. The final paragraph devastated Eddie. "Sarah doesn't know you're about to be executed. She thinks you're serving a life sentence, that you have time. But you don't. And she deserves to know the truth before you die. I'm giving you 48 hours to decide what to do with this information. Use it wisely." No signature, no name, just those words and a phone number at the bottom. Eddie sat in his cell, letter trembling in his hands. He had a decision to make. Call the number, demand answers, possibly delay his execution with new evidence. Or let it go, accept his fate, allow Sarah to live in peace without knowing her choices had led to his death. Eddie stared at the phone number until the words blurred, knowing whatever he decided would define not just how he died, but what his entire life had meant. At 11 p.m., Eddie made his decision. He called for a guard and requested his attorney. The guard laughed. "It's 11 at night, James. Your lawyer's not coming until morning." But Eddie insisted it was urgent, life or death. 2 hours later, at 1 a.m., his attorney Michael Brennan arrived, exhausted and irritated. Eddie showed him the letters, the photograph, the phone number. Brennan's irritation transformed into shock, then concern, then cautious skepticism. "Eddie, even if this is real, we have 36 hours. That's not enough time to investigate, file motions, get a stay. The system doesn't move that fast." But Eddie wasn't asking for a legal miracle. He was asking Brennan to make a phone call. Brennan dialed the number on speaker. It rang 4 times before someone answered. A man's voice, calm and measured. "I was wondering if you'd call." Brennan identified himself and demanded to know who he was speaking with and what evidence he possessed. The man refused to give his name, but offered something else, coordinates and a meeting location. "Tomorrow at noon, there's a storage unit in Indianapolis. The key will be under the 3rd brick from the door. Inside, you'll find everything you need. Proof Sarah Mitchell is alive, documents showing the real identity of the Jane Doe, and evidence of who orchestrated the deception. But I need something in return." Brennan asked what. Eddie needs to confess to something he's never told anyone. Something that will prove he's finally ready to face the complete truth. Eddie's stomach dropped. He knew immediately what the man meant. There was one secret Eddie had never shared with anyone. A secret so buried that Eddie himself tried to forget it existed. But apparently, someone knew. The man continued. "If Eddie confesses to what happened in Beckley on June 4th, 1993, then I'll make sure Sarah knows the truth before he dies. I'll give her the chance to say goodbye, if she wants. But if he stays silent, she'll live believing he moved on and forgot about her." Those are the terms. Brennan looked at Eddie, confused. What happened in Beckley in 1993? Eddie's face had gone pale, hands shaking. That date was seared into his memory, a night he'd spent 15 years trying to erase. Eddie took a deep breath and began to speak. Eddie sat staring at the phone number for 3 hours. At 11 p.m., he called for a guard and requested his attorney. The guard laughed. "It's 11 at night, James. Your lawyer's not coming until morning." But Eddie insisted it was life or death. 2 hours later, attorney Michael Brennan arrived, exhausted and irritated. Eddie showed him the letters, the photograph of Sarah alive. Brennan's irritation transformed into shock. If this is real, everything changes. Your motive for killing Torres was based on believing he murdered her. We might get a stay of execution, maybe a new trial. Eddie shook his head. I still killed Torres. That doesn't change. I just need to know the truth before I die. Make the call. Brennan dialed the number on speaker. A man's voice answered. I was wondering if you'd call. Brennan demanded to know who he was speaking with. The man refused his name, but offered coordinates to a storage unit in Indianapolis. Inside, you'll find proof Sarah Mitchell is alive, documents showing the real Jane Doe's identity, and evidence of who orchestrated the deception. But I need something in return. What? Brennan asked. Eddie needs to confess to what happened in Beckley on June 4, 1993. If he tells the truth, I'll make sure Sarah knows everything before he dies. If he stays silent, she'll believe he forgot about her. Those are the terms. Brennan looked confused. What happened in Beckley? Eddie's face went pale, hands trembling. That's the day I killed a child, he whispered. Eddie took a deep breath. I was 21, running product for Marcus Williams. There was a big deal, $50,000 in heroin. The buyer, James Pritchard, brought his 14-year-old son Daniel. The deal went fine, but James got pulled over 3 blocks away. Broken taillight. The cop found the heroin, arrested him. Daniel watched his father get dragged away in handcuffs. Eddie's voice cracked. 2 days later, Marcus said James was talking to cops, ready to give up my name. He told me to grab James's son, use him as leverage. I found Daniel after school, told him I needed to talk about his father. He got in my car. I drove to a remote area, planning to scare him into convincing his father to stay quiet. But Daniel panicked. He tried to run. We struggled. His head hit the dashboard. There was a crack. He went limp. No pulse. Daniel Pritchard was dead. 14 years old. Tears streamed down Eddie's face. I buried him in the woods off Route 19, near an old mining road. I marked the location in my memory. Never forgot it. Not for one day in 26 years. James Pritchard kept quiet, served 8 years. He spent the rest of his life searching for his son, died 3 years ago still believing Daniel was alive somewhere. The voice on the phone spoke softly. Daniel's mother Carol is 68, still searching for her son. Every year, she places missing person ads. Every Christmas, she keeps his bedroom exactly as it was. That's what you took from her. 26 years of false hope. Eddie nodded. I know. I stayed silent because I was a coward. But the truth is I'm a child killer. That's what I am. The voice continued. Tell Mr. Brennan where Daniel's body is. He'll notify authorities anonymously. The Pritchard family will finally get their son back. In exchange, I'll contact Sarah and tell her everything. I'll give her the choice to reach out in your final hours. Deal? Yes, Eddie said immediately. Eddie wrote detailed directions. Route 19 south from Beckley, 8 miles. Past the old mining road, 2 more miles. Right side, rock formation called the Leaning Tower. Walk northeast 300 yards to a clearing with a dead lightning-struck oak. The grave is 15 feet north of that tree. Brennan took the paper. I'll get to Indianapolis, retrieve the evidence, and make the anonymous call. Then we'll figure out if this gives us grounds for a stay. Eddie shook his head. I don't want to stay. I still killed Torres. That's what I'm being executed for. The truth about Sarah doesn't change that. Let the execution proceed. I just wanted to know she was okay and make things right with the Pritchard family. Brennan drove through the night to Indianapolis. By dawn, he returned with documents and photographs. Sarah living in Vancouver under the name Rebecca Walsh. Documents showing the Jane Doe was actually Jennifer Cole, murdered in Baltimore. And proof that Rebecca Stone, the journalist, was really Elizabeth Garrett, a former CIA operative who helped Sarah fake her death. Brennan filed an emergency motion for stay of execution at 8 a.m. The execution was scheduled for 6 p.m., 10 hours. At 10 a.m., West Virginia authorities confirmed they found human remains at Eddie's location. The bones matched Daniel Pritchard's description. After 26 years, the family would have answers. At noon, the court denied Brennan's motion. Not enough time to properly review the evidence. The execution would proceed as scheduled. At 3 p.m., Eddie received his final visitor. A woman with gray-streaked blonde hair and green eyes. Sarah. She had flown from Vancouver the moment Elizabeth Garrett told her the truth. They sat separated by glass, speaking through crackling phones. I'm so sorry, Sarah cried. I thought faking my death would set you free. I was wrong. You did what you thought was right, Eddie said. I don't blame you. Everything traces back to my choices. You were just trying to survive. They talked about what could have been, the life they might have lived. Sarah told him about her daughter Emma, now a nurse in Seattle, living a normal life untainted by their past. At 5:30, a guard knocked. Time was up. Sarah pressed her hand against the glass. Eddie matched it. I never stopped loving you, she whispered. I never stopped either, Eddie replied. Loving you was the best thing I ever did. Even if everything else was wrong, that part was right. Sarah was escorted out. Eddie returned to his cell for the final 20 minutes of his life. At 5:55, two guards came. It's time. Eddie stood and walked with them down the corridor toward the execution chamber. His legs felt heavy, but he kept walking. Toward the end he had earned, toward whatever waited beyond death. The execution chamber was a sterile room painted pale green, dominated by a gurney with leather restraints and 4 lines already prepared. A one-way mirror lined one wall where witnesses would watch Eddie die. Eddie knew Sarah wasn't among them. She had said her goodbye. That knowledge brought unexpected peace as guards guided him to the gurney. The guards strapped him down efficiently, securing his arms, legs, and torso. A medical technician inserted 4 lines into both arms, checking the saline flow. Eddie watched with detached curiosity, as if observing someone else's execution. Warden Robert Crawford stood nearby reading from a prepared script. Edward James, you have been convicted of the murder of federal agent David Torres and sentenced to death by lethal injection. This sentence will now be carried out under the authority of the United States District Court. Do you have any final words? Eddie took a deep breath. My name is Eddie James. I was born in Beckley, West Virginia, to parents who worked themselves to death for their children. I grew up poor, angry, convinced the world owed me something better. I made choices that destroyed lives, including my own. I became a drug dealer, poisoning struggling communities. I caused the death of Daniel Pritchard, an innocent child, and let his family suffer 26 years without answers. I killed Agent David Torres because I believed he murdered the woman I loved. I was wrong, but I still pulled the trigger. Eddie's eyes found the one-way mirror. To the families I've hurt, to Carol Pritchard who spent decades searching for her son, to anyone damaged by the drugs I sold or violence I caused, I'm sorry. Those words feel inadequate, but they're all I have. I can't undo what I've done. I can only accept responsibility and face the consequences. His voice grew softer. To Sarah Mitchell, wherever you are, thank you. Thank you for showing me what it felt like to be human, to care about someone beyond myself. Loving you is the only truly good thing I ever did. I hope you find peace and happiness. You deserve it. Eddie looked at the warden. And to anyone listening who thinks crime pays, who thinks you can outrun your choices, you're wrong. Eventually, the truth catches up. Eventually, you pay? I spent 15 years on death row carrying the weight of what I'd done. That's a prison worse than any cell. Learn from my mistakes. Choose better than I did. The warden nodded. Thank you, Mr. James. May God have mercy on your soul. He signaled to the executioner behind the wall. At exactly 6 p.m., the first drug entered Eddie's bloodstream. Sodium thiopental, a powerful sedative. Eddie felt coldness spreading through his veins, starting at his arms and moving toward his chest. His vision blurred, the harsh lights becoming soft and hazy. In those final seconds, Eddie's mind flashed through his life. His childhood home in Beckley. His mother's tired face. His first drug delivery at 13. Daniel Pritchard's terrified expression. Carol Pritchard's hollow eyes. The countless addicts whose lives he'd destroyed. And Sarah, that first night at the bar, her green eyes catching the light. The smile that broke through his walls. The love that survived everything. The sedative pulled Eddie deeper. His last conscious thought was a prayer, not for salvation, but a simple hope that Sarah would find happiness, that the Pritchard family would find peace, and that somehow the damage he'd caused might eventually heal. At 6:01, the second drug entered his system. Pancuronium bromide stopped all muscle movement. Eddie's breathing ceased. At 6:02, potassium chloride stopped his heart. The monitor showed a flat line. At 6:03, the medical technician checked for a pulse, found none, and nodded to the warden. The sentence has been carried out. Time of death, 6:03 p.m., August 16, 2019. The warden signed the documentation and dismissed the witnesses. Behind the glass, Michael Brennan filed out, his face drawn and pale. Also present was Robert Pritchard, Carol's brother, representing the family. He had come for closure, to witness on behalf of a sister who couldn't watch her son's killer die. 26 years of searching had finally ended. Sarah stood in the parking lot outside, leaning against her rental car as the sun set. When 6 p.m. came and went, she knew it was over. Eddie James was dead. She climbed into the car and sat crying for 20 minutes. Crying for everything lost, for the life they might have lived, for the boy Eddie had been before poverty twisted him into something dangerous. Crying for the terrible waste of it all. Inside, Eddie's body was prepared for transport. He had no family to claim him. He would be buried in the prison cemetery with a simple marker. But Eddie had left his notebooks to Sarah through Brennan. His memoir, 15 years of writing, for her to decide what to do with. 3 weeks later, authorities held a press conference announcing the recovery of Daniel Pritchard's remains. Carol Pritchard, 68 and frail, stood beside her brother. "Nothing can bring Daniel back," she said, voice shaking. "But at least now I can lay him to rest properly. At least now I know where he is. That's something." Asked about Eddie's execution, Carol paused. "I'm glad he told the truth before he died. As for his execution, I don't know how I feel. It won't bring Daniel back, but at least he can't hurt anyone else." The Pritchard family held Daniel's funeral the following week. They buried him next to his father. The headstone read, "Daniel James Pritchard, 1979 to 1993. Beloved son, finally home." Sarah returned to Vancouver and read all 43 of Eddie's notebooks. Thousands of pages documenting his entire life. She learned things she never knew. That Eddie had suspected she was an informant, but fell in love anyway. That even after her betrayal, he never stopped loving her. She learned about Daniel Pritchard, about the guilt Eddie carried for 26 years, about his discovery of Torres's corruption. Sarah decided not to publish Eddie's memoir. The families had suffered enough. Instead, she donated the notebooks to a university archive specializing in criminal justice reform. Names would be redacted, researchers could study them academically, nothing published without family approval. It honored the truth while protecting people who had been hurt enough. Elizabeth Garrett, the CIA operative who orchestrated Sarah's fake death, disappeared after Eddie's execution. Her real identity remained classified, her motives mysterious. The truth remained hidden in files that would likely never see light. Eddie James became a footnote in true crime history, occasionally mentioned in documentaries. Legal scholars debated whether his execution was justice or revenge, but most people forgot about him within months. Years later, a documentary filmmaker tried to interview Sarah. She declined, offering only a brief statement. Eddie James was a complicated man who made terrible choices, but ultimately tried to make things right at the end. He was neither monster nor martyr, just human and flawed like everyone else. I choose to remember the good parts while acknowledging the harm he caused. That's all I have to say. And so ends the story of Eddie James, a man who started as a quiet kid in West Virginia and ended as an executed murderer on federal death row. His life was a cautionary tale about the drug trade, corruption, love, betrayal, and the crushing weight of secrets. But more than anything, it was about consequences. Every choice has them. Every action ripples outward, touching lives in ways we can never predict. Eddie learned that lesson too late. He spent his final years trying to make amends, confessing buried truths, accepting responsibility. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was acknowledgement that his life mattered, that his choices had consequences, that the people he hurt deserved truth, if nothing else. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice and mercy and the complicated space between, hit that like button. Drop a comment about Eddie's choices and whether true redemption is possible for someone who caused so much harm. And subscribe, because stories like this, real stories about real people navigating impossible moral landscapes, these are the stories that matter. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because Eddie's story isn't just about crime and punishment. It's about being human in a world that doesn't forgive easily, about the price we pay when we choose darkness, and about the courage it takes to finally face the truth. Eddie James spent his life